progress.
Hi, everybody. I'm Crystal Haynes. Tonight on Greater Boston, we'll take a look at the national right-wing push targeting diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts in schools. And one of their latest targets, Newton. Then she's known as a queen maker. Now, after decades of helping elect women to political office, Barbara Lee is winding down her career. I'll talk to the executive director of her foundation about her legacy in Massachusetts and beyond. Across the country, battles have been raging between parents and their kids' educators, led by a number of right-wing groups who've pushed to make school curriculums and diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives political issues. They've even found a home in the liberal city of Newton. A GBH News investigation has found that national groups like the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism and the Virginia-based Parents Defending Education have publicly attacked Newton educators, filed lawsuits against the schools, and even attempted to shut down one of the district's scholars program. I'm joined now by the reporters behind this story, GBH News education editor Meg Woolhouse and senior investigative reporter Philip Martin. Welcome so much to the show.
Thank you. Much appreciated.
So, Meg, I want to start with you about, we know that this is becoming a pervasive issue across the country as we've tracked these sort of groups pop up. Talk to me about how this investigation started.
It started because we noticed that there were protests happening in and around the schools related to LGBTQ events, and that people were turning out in great numbers. A number of parents' rights groups had filed complaints, lawsuits with the Department of Education, complaining that there were affinity groups in the schools and that the schools were not treating students fairly. But what wasn't known, and what we dove into as reporters, was exactly what were the forces at work here. And they're extremist forces, basically. The Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism has been having coffees and really whipping up parents with this idea that academics in Newton are failing, and they're failing because, and they're very explicit about this, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs.
Interesting. So, Philip, in talking to the folks for your story, parents, and I see there are other countergroups that are coming up to fight against this, were they surprised to start seeing this happening in their district? Especially, we mentioned Newton being a liberal place to live.
Well, I think a lot of people are surprised when things happen on a local level. A lot of communities like Newton, they observe, as my colleague Meg was saying, they observe these things on a national level. Yeah. You see what's happening in Florida. You see Moms for Liberty, which is an explicit right-wing group, and Parents Defending Education, explicit right-wing group that have developed a following, more than 200,000 around the country, collectively. And then you have other groups like FAIR, which is a Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, an innocuous sounding name, however, but it leans right. And I think a lot of parents, when they started getting involved in this issue of academic decline, and there is perceptible decline in Newton, as there have been in other communities post-COVID, as a result of the COVID crisis, they look for someone or something to blame. Now, a lot of these things start organically on the ground or grassroots. And this was largely a grassroots organization, but some parents within this grassroots, a group called Improve NPS, reached out to a national organization, in this case, FAIR. And reaching out to FAIR, they were looking for guidance. And what that guidance amounted to was basically, for example, what do we call ourselves? Rather than invoking the language completely of the civil rights movement, they decided to adopt a term called pro-human. That's what they were looking for, pro-human, as opposed to anti-racism. Yeah. In fact, many saw anti-racism as tantamount to racism, and said that what we're looking for in place of DEI is another way of addressing problems in the school that have that we recognize may be problematic. And they again vilified DEI while evoking this notion of colorblindness or race neutrality and pro-human as a way of trying to explain their own progressive position. This was posited as a progressive position, but what it really was is a position that militated against DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, it looks like by the names and by this language, it seems like it's more of an inclusion type of organization, but it's the opposite of that. It's trying to undermine some of the programs that helped even the score with underrepresented groups in Newton, correct?
Well, that's the idea.
Yeah.
The idea is, in speaking with some of these parents off the record, most would not talk on the record.
Interesting.
They said explicitly they do not believe that structural racism is something that exists. And if you come from that position, structural racism is something that's determined objectively. It's like saying climate change doesn't exist, and to have that position. So if you have the position that structural racism doesn't exist, then you have to ask, well, then why do we need diversity, equity, and inclusion? And this is what some of these parents were saying. And in place of DEI, again, they are saying that we just need a holistic approach to education, something that is race neutral, without recognizing the structural problems that exist within not just the Newton public schools, but most public schools that basically establish racism and discriminatory policies within the system. You may have very nice people, but you have a structure that basically still is embedded, or I should say, it still imbues discrimination within the system.
Yeah.
And can I also get back to your
yes.
question from before, too? Because another big factor in what drew our attention to this to Newton in particular, was that a group of parents wanted to create an advisory group, and that advisory group would basically work to advise the school committee on what curriculums would be, on what kind of books students would, on any matter in the schools. And it turned out that the people that were supporting that advisory committee were the people that took the greatest issue with diversity, equity, and inclusion programming in the schools. So a lot of parents in Newton were getting whipped up hearing a lot about academic decline, right? You're a parent, you spent a lot of money to live in the town of Newton on your house, and then all of a sudden you hear, oh, the schools just aren't performing like they used to. It's just not as good. And the undercurrent there very strongly was that diversity, equity, and inclusion programs were to blame. Now, as Philip said, nobody calls that outright when you call up someone to interview. But Philip unearthed an email that was being sent around by the people in these groups, and maybe, Philip, you want to talk about that, that said explicitly that they were concerned that schools were concerned exactly about diversity, equity, inclusion, and the teaching of white supremacy.
And what they call divisive language.
Well, talk to me about this email.
Well, the email, as Meg pointed out, the email essentially, with the things that some people would not say aloud, it was encapsulated in this email.
Interesting.
This email, which went out to quite a few families, I'm not sure the exact number, but quite a few, essentially said that what is being taught in the schools, this is similar language, by the way, to what you'll see in Florida. What's being taught in the schools is racially divisive language. By that, they meant to say, by teaching about the history of racism, by talking about the role of race in our history, by talking about racism as something that's real in terms of structures. In other words, they were talking about critical race theory that is not taught in the schools, but a lot of this falls under the rubric of many people talking about critical race theory. What they're really talking about is any discussion of race is somehow or another considered divisive or divisive, as most people say, not Philip. And so it's quite intriguing. But let me also add that not all parents who are concerned about academic, and I would not even call it decline. There have been some ups and downs in test scores in Newton, but Newton is still among the top school districts in the state.
That's right.
And in the country. But when, as Meg said, when you pay, like $2 million to live in Newton, you don't want to just be among the top. You want to be the top. And so many people compare themselves with Lexington. They compare themselves with Brookline. And so you have this comparison going on. And if you aren't at the very top, folks consider that failure. But the fact of the matter is none of this, whatever that decline might be, it is not at all the result of diversity, equity, and inclusion. How do we know that? We consulted experts on this issue, and Meg can talk about that.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, we asked the dean at Harvard Graduate School of Education, or one of the deans there, about what was happening in Newton, and it turns out he lives there, and he was able to crunch the numbers.
Yeah.
And what he found was that over the last decade, AP scores have dropped a bit, and that they are, it's not entirely pandemic related. And then he also found that fewer students are taking the AP exam. But as he reiterated in his note, there is nothing, there is no thread of this that relates to DEI as the cause of this slip in academics. And there can be, obviously a zillion different reasons for this. So it was really important to get that feedback from him.
And if I can add, it is not to say that DEI is sacrosanct. That for example, as policy, as the way it's implemented, these things can't be criticized. We also consulted or interviewed Pedro Noguera, who's the head of the USC School of Education, one of the foremost experts on education in the country. He has a problem with some aspects of DEI, but also believes that structural racism is something that is a real problem, objectively determined, and that there are ways of creating DEI programs that are absolutely effective. And he does not see Newton as being in contravention to that. That Newton North, for example, high school happens to be led by a fellow named Henry Turner, the principal, who's an expert on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And he came into his job in 2016. That week, the school had experienced a rash of anti-Semitic incidents, which he addressed. And it had experienced young men driving around campus flying Confederate flags, which he addressed. Those are simply symptomatic of the problem. He was, what he's chosen to do is to try to address the problem structurally. That is to say, the inequity in grades, in grading. The school has sought to address the problem of tracking. And so now tracking is something that's in the past, I understand, at least in the middle schools. They've developed a greater equity among students as opposed to tracking students. The notion of putting people into various tracks according to perceived ability and testing.
Very interesting. And in the last 30 seconds or so, Meg, I would ask, obviously there's so much to unpack with this issue. What's next in terms of storytelling? Would you present this data to some of these groups?
That is such a good question.
Yeah.
I feel like with school committee elections happening in Massachusetts tomorrow and around the country, I think this is rich territory for further reporting. I also want to point out some of the bells that rang for us when you see a lot of people in a community who don't necessarily have children in the schools but are weighing in so heavily on these issues, which is what we saw in Newton. A lot of people at the forefront speaking out about this and bringing in sort of the politics of DEI into the conversation didn't actually have students in the schools. I think there's a feeling of, a sense of what is going on here, and how can the community respond? And I think that was what Henry Turner was left to do, because there were a lot of rumors and innuendos and false statements that were being made on social media. All of that is ripe for further reporting, and to see what's going to happen next with some of the groups and parents' rights groups around Massachusetts and beyond.
Absolutely.
Stay tuned.
We'll be watching. Yes, stay tuned. I love that. Meg Woolhouse and Philip Martin, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Kristen.
For 25 years, Barbara Lee has fought to change the face of American politics and elect women to political offices long dominated by men. Here in Massachusetts, she's helped launch the career of so many trailblazers, including Governor Maura Healey, Senator Elizabeth Warren, Congresswomen Catherine Clark and Ayanna Pressley, and Boston Mayor Michelle Wu, just to name a few. It all started a quarter of a century ago with the goal of helping elect the first woman president of the United States. Now, Lee's first campaign in 1998 named Hillary Clinton as one of several names put forth for that job. And Lee would go on to be one of Clinton's biggest donors in 2016. Well, now the philanthropist and political powerhouse is getting ready to hang up her hat, announcing plans to wind down her foundation and her work by the end of next year. So joining me now to reflect on her legacy are Amanda Hunter, the executive director of the Barbara Lee Family Foundation, and Aaron O'Brien, an associate professor of political science at UMass Boston. Welcome.
Great to be here.
Thank you.
So Amanda, in researching this is a staggering number here. More than 200 women in 37 states. Barbara has gotten elected to office since 1998. Incredible. But we were talking about how the landscape has changed a lot in that time.
Absolutely. And they say that you don't often get to thank your heroes. And I've been fortunate enough to get to work with one of mine for the last almost 7 years, truly. Because Barbara really has always done this work because she wants to see a woman president. And that is really her goal. And that number doesn't include all of the women that she supported who were not successful in their elections either. Just to set the stage, in 1998, there were only 63 women serving in Congress. Today, there are 150, more than twice as many. There were only 3 women serving as governor. And now there are a record 12, and only 18 women had ever been governor in history. And now we're up to 49. So there's still some room for growth there. But when you look around, Barbara's influence is truly everywhere.
That's certainly for sure. Aaron, let's talk about some of the barriers to entry for women, especially in the political arena.
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of them still remain, but organizations like Barbara's made a real difference. It's still that women run for office later. Young people start out as equally interested in politics, but as they age, as they go through school, women's ambition or girls' ambition drops. That's because of political socialization. It's not because girls are less ambitious from jump. Women, as I said, start later because they're still disproportionately responsible for family, both their kids as well as parents. So there's still a lot of barriers there. But what Barbara and the foundation has done, one of the barriers is no longer the idea that women shouldn't be running for office. Mass publics, regular voters are willing to vote for women, and they don't really think second about it. Now, they're not just going to vote for you because you're a woman, but women are viewed as viable candidates, and they get as much money. It used to be that women had a harder time raising money, but again, via the foundation and groups like Emily's List, women can raise money on par with men.
Amanda, with Barbara winding down her efforts, there has to be some sort of group that's going to fill that void. Certainly things have gotten better. We are seeing more women in office, but they're still going to need that support. They're still going to need that person that's going to slip that note in their pocket and say, you're smart, you should run, like Ayanna Pressley recounts at her meeting Barbara at a event at Harvard.
Well, you're absolutely right. And one reason that Barbara started the foundation was to do nonpartisan research to understand voter bias when it comes to women's gender and women's race. And so many women and academics have benefited from that research. And she's really given language to women's experiences that didn't exist before. Things like the likability tightrope that women have to walk, or the imagination barrier, because a majority of voters still picture a man when they picture a governor. Back when Barbara started this work, people weren't talking so openly about these barriers. And now we see it everywhere, including in the Barbie movie. A lot of America Ferrera's incredible monologue really reflected so much of the work that we've done at the foundation. So we're really proud that we've influence the conversation. And as part of the sunset announcement, we are also going to be distributing support to a number of colleague organizations. So when Barbara started, there wasn't the infrastructure of groups to support women like there is now. And Barbara announced $2.5 million in support to a number of nonpartisan and educational groups that support women running for office to mirror our 25 years of work.
It's so interesting, that term you said, the imagination barrier. And as you're reading the accounts, like we mentioned, Ayanna Pressley, Maura Healey, like, didn't even occur to them that they could run, and then have gone into their offices, and in Pressley's case, won re-election. And in Maura Healey's case, went from AG to governor of Massachusetts. How important is it to break that barrier, Erin, when we're talking about the political landscape and sort of also the psychology of politics?
It's vital. First, women, as we've talked about, still need to be they're more likely to need to be asked, to be encouraged, that imagination. But once they're asked, look what women can do here in Massachusetts. And what I love in part about the foundation is, yes, it matters. It feels better to have a government that looks like the citizens, including women of color. So that is important, that descriptive representation. But what the foundation and myself and scholars of women in politics point out, it's not just a feel-good prerogative. Mm-hmm. It's because policy outcomes change when women are there. Policy becomes more representative of the whole of the population, and women bring up issues that men might vote the same on, but they put them on the agenda. There's a different agenda setting space. So that's why it does feel good, and I love feeling good, but it also matters for democratic outcomes and the kind of policies to be reflective of the whole of the population here in Massachusetts and in the country, of course.
Yeah, and I'm thoughtful of the conversation around that woman voter that has become increasingly more important. And I imagine that you can attribute some of that importance to the work that Barbara's doing with some of the other nonprofits in this infrastructure. And Amanda, I'd love you to talk a little bit to that.
It's so important, and we found in our research again and again, to remind people that women are not monolithic in the way that they vote. And women often, just like all voters, prioritize their ideology over voting for someone as a result of their gender. But where we have seen a big shift is with women's political engagement, and even as being political donors, even giving a modest amount of money. One thing that Barbara has always talked about is empowering women to become involved in the process. And we did research on women voters with our partners at American University and found that even though women reported consuming the same amount of political news as men, they were 50% more likely to say they didn't feel prepared enough to participate in politics. So women still feel like they have to be overqualified, whether they're just volunteering on a campaign or voting. But it definitely, after 2016, we saw a big shift in the way that women were participating, and I don't think we're ever going back.
As we look forward to the next election, which we already know has frankly already started, Erin, and you see someone like Barbara sort of winding things down, other organizations trying to step into those very big shoes, right? What kind of impact do you think that's going to have as we go into the next election cycle, and especially the election cycles even tomorrow with the city council in Boston, right, and then also as we look at Congress and things in the Senate and things like that going down the line here?
Well, I smiled in part because I'm an American University alum from that Women in Politics program. And that's important because it's intergenerational. The foundation, we can't ask one person to do it all.
That's right.
The foundation, she deserves a break. And to pass that baton on. And importantly, Barbara and others have created an infrastructure. I teach women in politics. That's not a course that I had to add and fight for. It's a course that's recognized as important. And so that foundational work has been done. And there's a lot of individuals, women and men in my classes who care about seeing women in office. So I think we see that it's time for the generational shift. and passing of that baton. But gosh, there's a lot of organizations, there's a plethora of talent that is working together and not against one another to move that forward.
That's for sure. Amanda, I wonder you can share, and you probably have many Barbara stories, but one that comes to mind that you might think is unique or interesting that you would like to share with our audience.
Well, there are so many stories, but I think as someone who's been fortunate enough to get to work for her for over 6 years, she's also just such a delight as a boss and as a mentor. We were reminiscing over the weekend that she always has life advice for everybody. And even though she's about 5'2", she moves very fast. She was a basketball player when she was younger, and she always wore flats and always encouraged all of the women on her team to wear flats as well, and just to do what made them comfortable and to empower ourselves. And it's been really amazing to work in that type of an environment. I grew up in Massachusetts. I always was aware of Barbara and always wanted to work for her, but I never thought that I would have the opportunity to spend so much time actually doing so. And what a time in history to be able to do this work.
Does she?
Can I share a quick one?
Of course, yes.
This is a great one, I think. So a good friend of mine was running for office and a local city council race. And she called me and said, "Do you know this Barbara Lee?" I'm like, "Yeah." So now my work life is with my friend life. And my friend knocked on Barbara's door, just get out the vote effort. And Barbara's like, "Oh, come in." And totally coached her up just because my friend was out doing the work, knocking on doors, and Barbara worked with her and helped her quite a bit. So she walks the walk beyond the research.
Yeah. And, I'll give you the last word here, Amanda, in the last 30 seconds or so. What do you think Barbara reflects on her own legacy, or is she just like, okay, here you go, here's the baton?
Barbara also wants to be very clear that she's not totally leaving this world. She will still be engaged as a private citizen and cheering people on, maybe with her grandchildren running around next to her and maybe wearing different outfits, but she'll still stay engaged. But I think one of the biggest parts of her legacy is breaking down the imagination barrier. She's always called Massachusetts the original old boys club. When you look around, it looks pretty different around here than it did when Barbara started. And there's going to be a whole generation that's going to grow up never remembering a time when there were not women and people of color leading this state, leading Boston, leading cities around the state. And that's where we're going to see transformational change in voter opinion.
Well, thank you so much, Amanda Hunter and Aaron O'Brien, for your time.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for tonight, but come on back tomorrow. GBH's Adam Riley will be following key races, several of them, all election day long. He'll join us on what's at stake before the polls close. That and more tomorrow at 7. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.
Crimes are linked.